They said it was impossible. They said physics didn't work that way. In the early 1970s, drag racing had a single immutable law. There is no replacement for displacement. If you wanted to win in pro stock, you bought a Chrysler. You took a massive 426 Hemi, you put it in a Barracuda or a Duster, and you steamrolled everything in your path. The Hemi wasn't just an engine, it was a deity. It was the elephant. It breathed fire. It made over 500 horsepower without breaking a sweat, and it had totally demoralized the competition. Ford had given up. Chevrolet was running scared. The idea that a tiny, rust-prone economy car with a small block engine, a mouse motor, could even qualify against these monsters was laughable. It was like bringing a knife to a nuclear war. But then, in 1972, a white Chevrolet Vega rolled into the staging lanes at Pomona. It looked like a commuter car. It sounded like a chainsaw. And 9.6 seconds later, it didn't just beat the Hemi, it ended an entire era of automotive history. This wasn't just an upset, it was a humiliating public execution of the bigger is better philosophy, orchestrated by a cigar-smoking genius who realized that the NHRA rulebook had a loophole big enough to drive a Vega through. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about forgotten racing loopholes and the mechanics who exploited them. If you're someone who loves seeing the underdog outsmart the establishment with pure engineering, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing. To understand why this car was such a scandal, you have to understand the world it was born into. The year is 1971. Pro Stock is the hottest class in drag racing. It's the factory hot rod class. The fans loved it because the cars looked like the ones they drove to work. If you owned a Plymouth Cuda, you could watch Ronnie Sox win on Sunday and feel like a champion on Monday. But for General Motors fans, Sundays were miserable. The class was absolutely dominated by Mopar, specifically the team of Sox and Martin. They were winning everything. The Hemi engine was a masterpiece of airflow. It had massive valves, hemispherical combustion chambers that allowed for a straight shot of fuel and air, and a bottom end that could handle atomic bomb levels of stress. In 1971, the Hemi was winning 90% of the races. It was a monopoly. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't Chevy just build a better big block? Well, look, they tried. They had the 427, they had the 454, but the big block Chevy, as good as it was, had a fundamental problem. It was heavy. It was a boat anchor. To make it competitive with a Hemi, you had to spin it hard. And when you spun a 454 hard, bad things happened. Valve trains disintegrated. Connecting rods decided they wanted to be on the outside of the block. The Chevy teams were blowing up engines trying to keep up, while the Hemi guys were just cruising. It was demoralizing. The prevailing wisdom was that you needed torque to move a 3,000-pound door slammer down the quarter mile, and torque comes from cubic inches, period. End of discussion. Enter Bill Jenkins. They called him Grumpy for a reason. He wasn't a polished corporate spokesman. He was an engineer. He didn't care about marketing, he didn't care about brand loyalty, and he certainly didn't care about what the experts in the magazine said. He cared about numbers. He cared about efficiency. And while everyone else was obsessing over horsepower dyno sheets, Jenkins was obsessing over a different number entirely: pounds per cubic inch. Here's what most people don't realize about the 1972 season. The NHRA, in an attempt to slow down the Hemis and make the racing closer, tweaked the rulebook. They introduced a sliding weight scale based on engine size and wheelbase. They wanted to give the smaller engines a fighting chance. The rule stated that a car with a small displacement engine could run at a lighter overall weight. Specifically, a small block car could weigh significantly less than a big block car. Most racers looked at this rule and shrugged. They did the math in their heads and decided that a 100-pound weight break wasn't worth giving up 150 horsepower. They thought, sure, I can run lighter, but I'll have no top end. They stuck with their big blocks. They stuck with the brute force method. But Jenkins saw something else. He saw a math problem that everyone else was getting wrong. He realized that drag racing isn't about horsepower, it's about the power-to-weight ratio. It's simple physics. If you can make a car 20% lighter, you need 20% less power to go the same speed. But it goes deeper than that. Think about it like this. Imagine you're trying to push a refrigerator across a slippery floor. Now imagine you're trying to push a cardboard box. Even if you're not that strong, you can move the box faster than the strongest man in the world can move the fridge. Jenkins realized that a lighter car didn't just accelerate faster, it stopped better, it broke fewer parts, and most importantly, it was easier on the tires. The Hemi cars were shredding their rear slicks trying to put 600 horsepower to the ground. A lighter car wouldn't have that problem. So Grumpy Jenkins made a decision that shocked the paddock. He announced he was ditching his Camaro, a car that had won championships, and switching to a Chevrolet Vega. Now you have to understand, the Vega was a joke. It was GM's attempt to fight the Toyota Corolla and the VW Beetle. It was small, it was flimsy, and the engine it came with was an aluminum four-cylinder that was notorious for warping if you looked at it wrong. Nobody raced Vegas. They were grocery getters for secretaries and college students. Putting a race engine in a Vega was like putting a jet engine in a shopping cart. It seemed structurally unsound. But Jenkins wasn't looking at the Vega as a car. He was looking at it as a shell. A very, very aerodynamic shell. The Vega had a low frontal area. It was small. It punched a smaller hole in the air than the boxy Cudas and Mustangs. And because the wheelbase was short, the weight transfer characteristics were interesting. Jenkins hypothesized that if he could build a chassis stiff enough to handle the torque, the short wheelbase would actually help the car launch harder. The weight would transfer to the rear tires instantly. This is where it gets really interesting. Jenkins didn't just strip a Vega and put a roll cage in it. That's what people did in the 60s. No, Jenkins went to a company called SRD, Speed Research and Development, and he basically commissioned the custom-built race car that just happened to look like a Vega. This was the birth of the tube chassis car. Before this moment, pro stock cars were unibody cars. They relied on the factory sheet metal for structural integrity. You took a street car, welded in some bars, and went racing. Jenkins' Vega was different. It was a space frame, a complex lattice of steel tubing that provided immense rigidity while weighing absolutely nothing. The body of the Vega was just a skin draped over this engineering masterpiece. When the car showed up at the 1972 Winter Nationals, the Mopar guys laughed. They saw a tiny white toy. They saw a small block Chevy, a 331 cubic inch engine that looked like it belonged in a Corvette, not a pro stocker. They were running 426 cubic inches. Jenkins was giving up almost 100 cubic inches of displacement. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. How could he possibly make up that difference? They didn't know that Jenkins had found a way to spin that small block to 9,000 RPM. And they didn't know he had completely redesigned the suspension geometry to exploit the lighter weight. And they certainly didn't know that this cute little car was about to run a 9.60 and reset the national record on its very first outing. The laughter stopped the moment the light turned green. That first pass at Pomona in 1972 wasn't just a race, it was a paradigm shift. When the tree came down, the Hemi in the other lane, a massive, thundering beast of an engine, twisted the chassis of its Barracuda so hard you could see the left front tire lift a foot in the air. It was violent. It was impressive. It was exactly what drag racing was supposed to look like. But in the other lane, Jenkins' white Vega did something weird. It didn't twist, it didn't shudder, it just squatted slightly, planted its rear tires, and vanished. There was no drama. There was just instantaneous, linear acceleration. The small block Chevy screamed, a high-pitched, piercing wail that sounded more like a Formula One car than a drag racer. And before the Hemi driver could even grab second gear, Jenkins was 2 car lengths ahead. He crossed the stripe at over 140 miles per hour. The scoreboard lit up, 9.63 seconds. The crowd went dead silent for a split second, then erupted. A compact car, a car that people bought because they couldn't afford a Camaro, had just outrun the quickest pro stock field in history. Here's the thing, nobody understood what they had just seen. They thought it was a fluke. They thought maybe the clocks malfunctioned. But then he did it again and again. By the end of the weekend, Bill Grumpy Jenkins hadn't just won the Winter Nationals, he had collected $35,000 in prize money, a fortune in 1972, and he had done it with an engine that was 100 cubic inches smaller than his competition. The Mopar teams were furious. They were looking at their 426 Hemis, engines that cost tens of thousands of dollars to develop, and wondering how they were getting smoked by a 331 cubic inch mouse motor. They started filing protests. They demanded teardowns. They were convinced Jenkins was cheating. And this is where we get to the real secret, the illegal part that wasn't actually illegal yet. The magic wasn't just in the engine, it was in what Jenkins had done to the car itself. You see, the rulebook said the car had to retain the original body silhouette and wheelbase. It said the floor pan had to be stock appearing. It said the suspension mounting points had to be in the general vicinity of the original location. Jenkins looked at those words, silhouette, appearing, vicinity, and he drove a truck through them. While the Hemi Cudas were essentially street cars that had been stripped and reinforced, the Vega was built from the ground up as a race car. Jenkins acid dipped the body panels until they were paper thin. If you leaned on the fender too hard, you'd dent it. The glass was replaced with lightweight Lexan. The heavy steel bumpers were swapped for fiberglass replicas that weighed ounces, not pounds. But the real genius was the chassis. The tube frame design meant that the car was incredibly stiff. When a normal car launches, the chassis flexes. That flex is wasted energy. It's energy that isn't pushing the car forward. Jenkins' Vega was as stiff as a bridge. Every ounce of torque the engine produced went directly to the rear wheels. And because the car was so light, we're talking under 2,000 pounds without the driver, Jenkins could move weight around. He could put ballast exactly where he wanted it to optimize traction. He put the battery in the trunk, not just to move it out of the engine bay, but to put 40 pounds over the right rear tire to counteract torque twist. He was playing 3D chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Now, you might be thinking, wait, acid dipping? Isn't that illegal? Well, technically, no, not explicitly. The rules said the body panels had to be steel. They didn't say how thick the steel had to be. Jenkins argued that it was still the factory steel, just less of it. And since the car met the minimum weight requirement for its class, the NHRA tech inspectors had a hard time failing him. He was adhering to the letter of the law while completely violating the spirit of it. And that, my friends, is the definition of racing genius. Let's talk about that engine for a second, because the chassis was only half the equation. The 331 cubic inch small block was a marvel. To make up for the lack of displacement, Jenkins had to make the engine breathe. He needed airflow. The problem is, small blocks have small valves. You can't fit a massive intake valve in a small cylinder bore. So Jenkins did something radical. He focused on velocity. The Hemi relied on massive ports that flowed a ton of air, but at low RPM, the air moved slowly. It was lazy. Jenkins' small block had smaller ports, but the air moved through them at supersonic speeds. This meant that when he cracked the throttle, the engine responded instantly. There was no lag. The cylinder filling was incredibly efficient. And then there was the RPM. The big Hemis made peak power around 6,500 or 7,000 RPM. Above that, the heavy pistons and long connecting rods started to stress the block. Jenkins' small block had tiny, lightweight pistons. It had a short stroke. He could rev that thing to 9,000 RPM all day long. In a drag race, gearing is everything. Because Jenkins could rev higher, he could run a steeper rear gear ratio. This multiplied his torque. So even though the Hemi made 600 foot-pounds of torque and the Chevy made 450, at the rear wheels, where it actually matters, Jenkins was putting down just as much force, but he was doing it in a car that weighed 500 pounds less. It was a mathematical slaughter. The impact of this car on the sport was immediate and devastating. Sales of the Chevy Vega skyrocketed. Suddenly, every kid in America wanted a Vega. They didn't care that the street version was terrible. They saw Grumpy Jenkins beating the Hemis and they wanted a piece of that glory. General Motors, who had officially pulled out of racing, was secretly delighted. They couldn't sponsor him openly, but mysteriously, pallets of experimental engine parts started showing up at Jenkins' shop in Malvern, Pennsylvania. Blocks with higher nickel content, cylinder heads with revised casting numbers. The backdoor factory support was in full swing. But the competition wasn't going to take this lying down. The Mopar teams, led by the legendary Sox and Martin, started lobbying the NHRA hard. They claimed Jenkins had an unfair advantage. They claimed the weight brakes were too generous for small blocks. They claimed the Vega body was too aerodynamic compared to the brick-like aerodynamics of the Plymouth Duster. It was ironic, really. The guys who had dominated for 5 years with a superior Hemi were now crying foul because someone had built a better mousetrap. Here's what most people don't realize about the 1972 season. It became a war of escalation. Every week, Jenkins would show up with a new tweak, maybe a different carburetor spacer, maybe a new header design. And every week, the Mopar guys would try to copy him. They started cutting weight out of their cars. They started experimenting with smaller engines, but they were playing catch-up. Jenkins had a 2-year head start on the physics of lightweight racing. He had already figured out the suspension geometry that worked with a short wheelbase. The Hemi cars were trying to apply big car tuning to a game that had fundamentally changed. They were dinosaur hunters in a world that had suddenly been taken over by raptors. By the middle of the season, the writing was on the wall. The era of the muscle car was ending, and the era of the purpose-built race car had begun. The Vega proved that you didn't need a factory production line to win. You needed a welder, a slide rule, and a total disregard for convention. But just as Jenkins was getting comfortable on his throne, the NHRA decided they had seen enough. They couldn't have a discontinued economy car embarrassing the flagship muscle cars of Detroit forever. The rulebook was about to change again, and this time they were going to target Grumpy specifically. The 1973 season opened with a target painted squarely on the back of Bill Jenkins' white Vega. The NHRA competition director had heard the complaints from the Chrysler camp loud and clear. "The Vega's too light," they said. "The wheelbase is too short," they argued. "It's not a real car," they whined. And honestly, they had a point. The rulebook stated that pro stock cars were supposed to be factory experimental vehicles, but what Jenkins had built was effectively a funny car with doors. It was a purpose-built dragster wearing a Chevrolet mask. The NHRA responded in the only way they knew how. They added weight. They slapped a factor penalty on small block cars with short wheelbases. Suddenly, the Vega had to carry an extra 100 pounds of lead ballast. Here's the thing, most racers would have panicked. Adding 100 pounds to a race car is like asking a sprinter to run a marathon in work boots. It destroys your power-to-weight ratio. It ruins your suspension setup. It changes the way the car launches. But Jenkins didn't panic. He just lit another cigar and went back to the dyno room. He knew something the NHRA didn't. He knew that while they were busy trying to slow him down with lead weights, he had already found another 40 horsepower in the cylinder heads. See, the secret to the small block Chevy wasn't just that it was light, it was that it was incredibly thermally efficient. The big block Hemis were massive chunks of cast iron. They held heat like a radiator. In drag racing, heat is the enemy. A hot engine pulls in less oxygen. A hot engine makes less power. The small block Chevy, with its compact design and efficient cooling passages, could shed heat much faster. Jenkins realized that if he could keep the engine cooler between rounds, he could run more aggressive timing. He could lean out the fuel mixture without melting a piston. While the Hemi guys were frantically packing bags of ice on their intake manifolds in the staging lanes, trying to cool down their massive engines, Jenkins was sitting there, calm and collected, with an engine that was ready to make peak power from the first hit of the throttle. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so he had a cooler engine. Big deal. But in a sport decided by thousandth of a second, temperature is everything. Jenkins developed a system to circulate ice water through the block during the run. He had a small reservoir of ice water in the trunk, pumped through the engine to keep the cylinder walls at a precise temperature. This allowed him to run tighter piston-to-wall clearances, which meant better ring seal, which meant more compression. It was a cascade of marginal gains. Every single component was optimized not just for power, but for the specific environment of a 9-second drag race. This is where it gets really interesting. The tube chassis revolution that the Vega started wasn't just about weight. It was about tuning. In a stock body car, a unibody car like a Camaro or a Cuda, the chassis is a giant spring. When you launch, the body twists. That twist is uncontrolled energy. You can't tune sheet metal. But with a tube chassis, you have a rigid platform. Jenkins could adjust the 4-link rear suspension to change how the car reacted to the track surface. If the track was greasy, he could change the instant sensor of the suspension to plant the tires harder. If the track was sticky, he could loosen it up to let the car roll out easier. The Hemi cars, with their leaf spring suspensions and heavy bodies, were basically one-trick ponies. They launched one way, and if the track conditions changed, they were out of luck. Jenkins had a car that was adjustable. He could adapt to the track in ways his competitors couldn't even comprehend. The sheer dominance of the Vega forced the entire industry to pivot. By late 1973, you started seeing Vega clones popping up everywhere. Ford teams started building Pintos. AMC teams started building Gremlins. The compact car revolution had taken over pro stock. The days of the 3,500-pound muscle car were dead, buried by a grumpy engineer from Pennsylvania. But Jenkins didn't stop at the chassis. He revolutionized the transmission, too. Up until this point, most drag racers used modified factory 4-speed transmissions. They were strong, sure, but they were heavy and slow to shift. Jenkins started working with a company called Lenco. They developed a planetary gear transmission, basically an automatic transmission that you shifted manually with levers. It allowed for lightning-fast shifts without using a clutch. You just pull the lever and bang, you were in the next gear. No missed shifts, no grinding gears, just seamless, uninterrupted power delivery. The Lenco transmission became the standard for pro stock for the next 40 years, and it was Jenkins who proved it worked in a small block application. But the most critical part of the puzzle was the driver. We focus so much on the engineering that we forget that Bill Jenkins was one of the best shoe drivers in the history of the sport. Driving a high RPM small block is not like driving a torque monster big block. With a Hemi, you could be a little lazy on the shift. The torque would pull you through. With a small block spinning at 9,500 RPM, if you miss your shift point by 200 RPM, the engine fell off its power peak and bogged. You had to be precise. You had to be a machine. Jenkins had an uncanny ability to feel the engine. He didn't use a shift light. He shifted by ear. He shifted by vibration. He knew exactly when the torque curve was starting to drop off, and he would snatch the next gear at that precise millisecond. The grumpy persona became a marketing goldmine. He played the villain perfectly. He would refuse interviews, he would scowl at fans, he would smoke his cigar in the winner's circle while everyone else was spraying champagne. And the fans loved it. They bought Grumpy's toy t-shirts by the thousands. They bought scale models of the Vega. Even the Chevy fans, who had been starved for a winner, embraced this anti-hero. He wasn't the clean-cut, corporate-friendly racer like Ronnie Sox. He was a working-class genius who beat the system with his brain. By 1974, the NHRA realized they had a problem. The small block Vegas and Pintos were so dominant that the big block cars were becoming obsolete. The fans wanted to see Mustangs and Camaros, not economy cars. So the NHRA did what they always do. They rewrote the rulebook again. They introduced a new formula that factored in engine displacement and vehicle weight in a way that effectively banned the super lightweight small cars. They wanted to force the class back to real cars. They set a minimum wheelbase that outlawed the Vega. They set a minimum weight that made the small block uncompetitive. It was a targeted strike designed to kill Grumpy's advantage once and for all. And you know what Jenkins did? He didn't complain, he didn't sue, he just looked at the new rules, did the math, and realized that if he couldn't run a Vega, he'd have to run a Monza. The Chevrolet Monza was slightly larger, slightly heavier, but it had better aerodynamics. And if the rules said he had to run a heavier car, well, that just meant he needed more power. So he went back to the drawing board on the engine. He started experimenting with even more exotic cylinder head designs. He started looking at 14:1 compression ratios. He started working on dry sump oiling systems, technology that was basically reserved for Formula One and IndyCar at the time. A dry sump system pumps the oil out of the engine into an external tank. This does two things. First, it prevents the crankshaft from splashing through a pool of oil in the oil pan, which robs horsepower. At 9,000 RPM, that windage loss can be 10 or 15 horsepower. Second, it ensures the engine always has oil pressure even during a violent 1.2-second launch. The NHRA had inadvertently forced Jenkins to innovate again. By trying to slow him down, they had pushed him into a new realm of engine technology. The Monza era was about to begin, and it would prove that the Vega wasn't a fluke. It was just the opening act. The 1975 season didn't just bring a new car, it brought a new kind of warfare. The Chevrolet Monza that rolled out of Jenkins' shop wasn't just a heavier Vega, it was the first true pro-stock car as we know them today. The Vega had been a hacked-up streetcar shell on a tube frame. The Monza was pure aerospace engineering. Jenkins had looked at the rulebook's wheelbase requirement and realized the Monza's body shape was actually better than the Vega's. It was slippery. It had a lower drag coefficient. At 150 miles per hour, air is like a solid wall. The Hemi cars with their flat grills and upright windshields were smashing into that wall. The Monza sliced through it. Here's the thing. Aerodynamics and drag racing were misunderstood in the 70s. People thought aero only mattered at 200 miles per hour. Jenkins knew better. He knew that even at 100 miles per hour, drag was robbing horsepower. He wind tunnel tested the Monza. He smoothed the underbelly. He sealed the door gaps. He even redesigned the hood scoop to not just grab air, but to pressurize the intake. This was the ram air effect on steroids. At speed, the air was being forced down the carburetor throat, essentially supercharging the engine naturally. While the competition was losing power at the top end of the track, Jenkins was gaining it. But the real revolution was happening inside the engine block. Remember that dry sump oil system I mentioned? It wasn't just about lubrication, it was about creating a vacuum. By sucking the oil and air out of the crankcase, the pump created a negative pressure environment. Now, you might be thinking, why does vacuum matter? Think about the pistons moving up and down. As a piston comes down, it has to push against the air trapped in the crankcase. That resistance is called parasitic drag. It robs power. By sucking that air out, Jenkins removed the resistance. The pistons could fall faster. The engine could rev even freer. This was free horsepower. It didn't cost fuel. It didn't add heat. It just unlocked potential that was being wasted. The dry sump system was worth 15 to 20 horsepower all by itself. In a class decided by inches, 20 horsepower is a landslide. This is where it gets really interesting. The competition knew Jenkins was doing something, but they couldn't figure out what. They would walk past his pits and hear a strange whining noise coming from the engine, the belt drive for the dry sump pump. They would see extra hoses running to the trunk. But Jenkins was paranoid. He covered everything. If a photographer got too close, he'd throw a shop rag over the engine or literally chase them away with a wrench. He understood that in racing, information is currency. If you give away your secrets, you give away your edge. The psychological toll on the other drivers was immense. Imagine you're Ronnie Sachs. You're the king of Mopar. You have the best factory backing, the best engines, the best team, and every weekend you get beat by a guy who looks like a disgruntled math teacher smoking a cheap cigar. It gets in your head. The Hemi team started overthinking. They started taking risks with their tunes, trying to find magic horsepower that wasn't there. They blew up engines, they broke transmissions, they beat themselves because they were so focused on beating Grumpy. Jenkins didn't just out-engineer them, they out-psyched them. And let's talk about the suspension again, because the Monza introduced another game changer, the McPherson strut. Before this, most drag cars used heavy control arms and coil springs like a truck. The Monza used struts, a simple, lightweight, integrated shock and spring unit. It shaved 40 pounds off the front end, but more importantly, it allowed for infinite adjustability. Jenkins could change the front ride height in minutes. He could change the rebound settings to control how fast the front end lifted. If the track was sticky, he'd tighten the struts to keep the nose down and let the rear tires do the work. If the track was loose, he'd loosen the struts to let the nose rise, transferring more weight to the rear. It was a tunable chassis in a way the old muscle cars could never be. By 1976, the Grumpy's toy Monza was the most famous race car in America. It was on magazine covers. It was a Hot Wheels car. It was everywhere. But the landscape was shifting. The very people Jenkins had beaten, the smart ones anyway, had started to learn. A team out of Michigan named Gap and Roush, yes, that Jack Roush, the NASCAR legend, had been watching Jenkins closely. They realized that if they wanted to win, they had to stop acting like hot rodders and start acting like engineers. They built a Ford Mustang II that was a carbon copy of Jenkins' philosophy. It was light, it had a small displacement engine, it had a complex suspension, and suddenly, Grumpy had a real fight on his hands. This is the nature of innovation. You can't keep a secret forever. Eventually, the paddock catches up. The trick of the week becomes standard practice. By the late 70s, every competitive pro stock car had a tube chassis. Every car had a dry sump. Every car had Lenco transmissions. Jenkins had single-handedly dragged the entire sport out of the Stone Age and into the modern era. He forced the Hemi guys to abandon their beloved elephant motors and start developing lighter, more efficient engines. He forced Ford to get serious about aerodynamics. He raised the bar so high that the old guard couldn't reach it. But Jenkins wasn't done. As the 70s closed, he saw another opportunity. The rules were shifting again, favoring larger displacement engines in lighter cars. The 500 cubic inch limit was approaching. Most people thought this meant the return of the Hemi. Jenkins disagreed. He believed the small block architecture could be scaled up. He started working on massive displacement small blocks, engines that looked like a mouse motor but displaced 400, 420, eventually 500 cubic inches. He was stretching the limits of metallurgy. He was boring out cylinders until the walls were paper thin, then sleeving them with high-strength steel. He was moving camshaft locations. He was welding blocks together. It was Frankenstein engineering, but it worked. The late 70s also saw the rise of the corporate racer. Bob Glidden, Warren Johnson. These guys were professionals with massive sponsorships. Jenkins, ever the independent, refused to play the corporate game. He wanted to race his way, on his terms. He turned down sponsorship deals that would have required him to smile for cameras or attend dinners. He just wanted to be in the dyno room. This stubbornness cost him money, sure, but it cemented his legend. He was the last of the true guitarristas, the guy who built the engine, tuned the chassis, drove the hauler, and drove the race car. Now, look, a lot of people think the story ends there. The Monza retired, Jenkins got older, and the sport moved on. But that's missing the point. The legacy of the Monza isn't just the trophies it won. It's the fact that every single pro stock car running today, whether it's a Camaro, a Mustang, or a Dodge, is a direct descendant of that car. If you peel back the carbon fiber body of a 2026 Pro Stogger, you see the same fundamental architecture Jenkins laid out in 1975. Tube chassis, strut front suspension, four-link, dry sump oiling, high RPM engine. He didn't just build a car, he built the blueprint for the next 50 years of drag racing. But there was one final chapter to the Jenkins saga that most people forget. The 1980s, the era of the big block return. Jenkins, now in his 50s, decided to step out of the driver's seat. He realized his reflexes weren't what they used to be, but his brain? His brain was sharper than ever. He became a hired gun, an engine builder for other teams. And this is where the grumpy power legends really exploded. He wasn't just building Chevys anymore. He was consulting for everyone. He was the Yoda of horsepower. If you had a problem nobody could solve, you went to Malvern, you paid the fee, you endured the cigar smoke and the insults, and you left with an engine that made 50 more horsepower than everyone else. This brings us to the final and perhaps most enduring secret of the Jenkins legacy, the splayed-valved cylinder head. By the 1980s, the easy horsepower had been found. Everyone had a tube chassis. Everyone had a Lenco, but Jenkins, now operating primarily as an engine builder for other drivers like Joe Lapone Jr., realized the limitation was still airflow. The standard Chevrolet valve angle was 23 degrees. It was a compromise for street cars. It meant the air had to turn a sharp corner to enter the cylinder. Jenkins wanted a straight shot. He wanted the air to fall into the engine, not fight its way in. So he started cutting. He literally sawed cylinder heads apart, moved the intake ports, changed the valve angles to 18 degrees, then 15, then 12. He welded them back together, creating Frankenstein heads that looked ugly but flowed air like a fire hose. Here's the thing. This wasn't just porting, this was re-engineering the geometry of the internal combustion engine. By standing the valves up straighter, he could use a flatter combustion chamber. A flatter chamber meant a more efficient burn. A more efficient burn meant he could run less ignition timing, which reduced the parasitic load on the pistons. It was the same philosophy he used on the Vega, efficiency over brute force, applied to the molecular level of the fuel burn. The result was an engine that didn't just make more power, it made cleaner power. It was smoother, it vibrated less, and it won. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, Grumpy's power decals started appearing on the fenders of cars that Jenkins didn't even own. He became the wizard behind the curtain. If you wanted to qualify for a pro stock field that was separated by 0.003 of a second, you needed Jenkins airflow technology. He was consulting for NASCAR teams. He was advising IndyCar engine programs. The University of Grumpy had graduates all over the motorsport world. Mechanics who had swept his floors in the 70s were now crew chiefs for championship teams using the very principles, systems integration, thermal management, friction reduction, that he had pounded into their heads with cigar smoke and grumbles. But let's go back to that white Vega for a moment. Because that car, that specific pile of steel tubing and fiberglass, represents the exact moment drag racing grew up. Before the Vega, people raced cars. After the Vega, people raced platforms. The impossible Vega proved that a car is just a math equation waiting to be solved. The Hemi was a variable. Weight was a variable. Aerodynamics was a variable. Jenkins showed that if you manipulated the variables correctly, the answer didn't have to be more cubic inches. The answer could be smarter engineering. When Bill Jenkins passed away in 2012, the entire racing world stopped. Not because he was a warm and fuzzy guy, he wasn't, but because everyone, from the 16-time champion John Force to the kid bracket racing his dad's Nova, owed him a debt. He had professionalized the sport. He had turned it from a weekend hobby for mechanics into a high-stakes engineering contest for scientists. The 500 cubic inch engines screaming to 10,500 RPM in pro stock today, they are the direct descendants of that 331 small block. The carbon fiber chassis that weigh exactly 2,350 pounds, they are the great-grandchildren of that acid-dipped Vega shell. Now, you might be thinking, was he really that grumpy? By all accounts, yes, but maybe that was the secret. Maybe you have to be a little dissatisfied with the world to change it. Maybe you have to look at a 426 Hemi and not see a legend, but see a heavy, inefficient lump of iron that needs to be beaten. Jenkins was never satisfied. Even when he was winning, he was looking for the next 100th of a second. He was looking for the next friction point to eliminate. He was looking for the next rule to bend. And in doing so, he taught us all a valuable lesson. The impossible is usually just an engineering problem you haven't solved yet. The Hemi was invincible until it wasn't. The big block was king until it was dethroned by a mouse. And the establishment was always right until a grumpy guy from Pennsylvania proved them wrong. That 1972 season didn't just give us a cool car, it gave us a blueprint for how to think. It taught us that if you're smart enough, if you're obsessive enough, and if you're willing to read the rulebook with a lawyer's eye and an engineer's brain, you can beat the giants. You can take a grocery getter and make it a legend. You can make the impossible look easy. So the next time you see a highlight reel of a pro stock car launching, front wheels in the air, engine screaming like a banshee, covering the quarter mile in 6.5 seconds, don't just watch the car. Watch the suspension work. Watch the chassis settle. Listen to the shift points. And remember that all of that precision, all of that science started with a man who looked at a Chevy Vega and saw a weapon. He saw what nobody else could see. And because of that, we are all faster for it. That is the legacy of Grumpy Jenkins. That is the secret of the small block. And that is why, over 50 years later, we are still talking about the time a fake economy car killed the muscle car era. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the engineering secrets of the past, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We break down the hidden history of speed every single week, from the unfair advantages to the banned technology. If it went fast and broke the rules, we're talking about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.